In 1866, the villagers of Ashcombe whispered of a disappearance so peculiar that it has never been fully explained. The case was not merely about a missing woman, but about the remnants she left behind, objects that seemed to carry more weight than any body or grave. 48 dresses, 112 letters, and a single emerald brooch, laid out with obsessive care, as if they were instructions, or worse, an inheritance of unease. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn to unsolved mysteries and the quiet dread of the unexplained, I invite you to subscribe to Silent Heirs, where stories like this one are given their place to breathe in the shadows. The woman at the center of this story was Eleanor Harroway, the youngest daughter of a once prosperous family tied to the shipping trade. By all outward accounts, she was destined for comfort, possibly marriage to a wealthy landowner. Yet behind the grand stone facade of Ashcombe Manor, her life was not one of luxury, but of silence. Neighbors remarked that she was rarely seen in town except on Sundays, and even then she was always draped in muted colors, never smiling, never speaking at length with anyone beyond a polite nod. Her mother had died when she was 13, and her father was known for his strict temper, a man who locked doors inside his own home and kept servants from venturing into certain wings of the estate after dark. It was in May of that year, during a week of unrelenting rain, that Eleanor is said to have vanished. Servants reported seeing her last in the sewing room, a chamber lit by a single oil lamp, where she spent her hours mending garments that appeared too new to require repair. When her door was opened the next morning, she was gone, but not in the way one expects when a person decides to flee. Nothing was packed. Instead, 48 dresses were carefully arranged across the floorboards, laid flat as though they had been pressed into the wood itself. Each dress carried a note pinned to its sleeve, numbered and dated. The first letter was dated 5 years earlier. The last was written the night before she disappeared. To this day, no one has read all of them. Some were destroyed in a fire that consumed part of the manor in the 1890s. Others were kept locked in county records, too fragmented to form a complete picture. What remains are excerpts, strange phrases that suggest Eleanor had been preparing for something beyond her own comprehension. She wrote of the procession at the gate, of the voice that asks for emerald, and of a second self, wearing me thin. The townspeople were quick to invent their own theories. Some claimed Eleanor had been courted by a traveler from the north, a man described only as too pale to belong here. Others believed she had fallen prey to melancholia and taken her own life in the manor's well. Yet no body was ever found, no clothing disturbed, and no trace of flight discovered in the mud of the gardens. Only the dresses remained. The emerald brooch complicates matters further. It was discovered on her writing desk, but unlike the other items, it was positioned with an unnerving precision. Its pin thrust deep into the oak, as though hammered there with deliberate force. When removed, the indentation in the wood bore a faint discoloration, green in hue, as if the brooch had bled into the grain. Over the decades, the brooch would resurface in local lore, each appearance tied to a new incident. A missing maid, a child claiming to see Eleanor's face in the manor's west window, even a cryptid sighting along the moors described as a woman in stitched skins. But the greatest source of dread lies not in these scattered tales, but in the letters themselves. One, preserved in the county archive, contains a single paragraph that scholars and folklorists have debated for generations. They promised me 48 nights, and on each I was to clothe myself differently, so they might not know my shape. On the final night, they will come to take me, and I must be dressed in none, for the emerald shall close where flesh cannot. Do not mourn. This is not leaving. This is returning. The phrasing unsettled even seasoned researchers. Was Eleanor describing a ritual, some act of binding that required her to prepare garments as disguises? Or was it madness, an internal unraveling of a woman trapped by her father's iron rule? Local legend insists that if you stand before the crumbling gates of Ashcombe Manor on the anniversary of her disappearance, you will see movement behind the shuttered windows. Some say it is Eleanor herself, trying on her dresses in endless repetition. Others whisper that the manor is no longer empty at all, that something else wears those garments, rehearsing the night she called her return. It is this duality, between the earthly and the otherworldly, that has kept the mystery alive. There were no official suspects, no conclusive evidence of crime, no confession or discovery of remains. What we are left with are objects: fabric, paper, and stone. Yet these simple items, bound together by a narrative of silence, hint at something far larger, something that does not rest. And it begins, as all lasting hauntings do, with the feeling that Eleanor Harroway's story is not over. The dresses were not her farewell. They were instructions left for those who came after. The letters, a diary written not for herself, but for whoever would stumble upon the pattern. And the emerald brooch, a key or perhaps a warning to a gate that does not exist on any map. What happened in that rain-soaked spring of 1866 may never be solved, but the dread remains, a slow echo across the centuries. Because the question is not where Eleanor went, but what had been waiting for her all along. The letters that survived the fire are uneven fragments, yet together they create a chilling cadence, like the refrain of a song hummed in the dark. One, dated 2 months before her disappearance, reads, "The dresses must be finished before the tide withdraws. I cannot stitch fast enough. They wait for me outside the hedge, though the hedge grows thicker each day. It is their patience that frightens me." Another, more fragmented, ends mid-sentence. "If the emerald remains open, I am still me. If it closes, I—" The rest was burned away, a black scar across the parchment. Historians have often dismissed these writings as the anxious ramblings of a secluded young woman, perhaps slipping into madness under the weight of isolation. Yet there is something methodical about her numbering, her precise cataloging of fabric and time. Each dress aligned with a letter, as though she was building a sequence, a correspondence between her garments and her fate. It was less the product of a wandering mind and more the work of a meticulous ritual. The servants, though silenced by Eleanor's father at the time, left behind testimonies later in life. One chambermaid recalled being sent into the sewing room only once, 3 years before the disappearance. She described the walls covered in chalk marks, tall vertical strokes counted into dozens, then crossed through in sets of 7. She saw a dress lying half-finished on the table, its hem stitched with horsehair rather than thread. And she remembered Eleanor looking up at her with such intensity that she fled the room without delivering her message. Eleanor's father, stern and controlling, ordered the sewing room locked after her vanishing. He told the villagers that she had run away, ashamed of her own unstable mind. But late in his life, after the fire had taken half the manor, he was heard muttering in the tavern that the brooch should never have been brought into the house. When pressed, he claimed it was a family heirloom traced back to a voyage in the 1790s, when one of his ancestors had returned from the West Indies with treasures best left at sea. The brooch, he said, was the last of those spoils. His words were dismissed as the drink-addled confessions of a bitter man, but the unease remained. What chills investigators even now is how closely Eleanor's descriptions align with later reports from the region. In 1892, a shepherd crossing the moor swore he saw a figure near the abandoned manor, dressed in a gown that seemed to flutter without wind. He described the fabric as alive, almost breathing. When he approached, the figure turned its head, revealing not a face, but a hollow space where threads unraveled like hair. He never returned to the moors after nightfall. In the early 20th century, the manor's ruins became a place of whispered dares. Schoolchildren would slip through the rusting gates to touch the outer walls. Some came back with faint green stains on their hands, though no moss grew there. Others spoke of a woman's voice calling their names from within, though each swore they had never told the voice who they were. These accounts mirror the cryptic language in Eleanor's final letters. They know the name but not the face. That is why the dresses must change. If I am no one's shape, they cannot keep me. Paranormal researchers who visited Ashcombe in the 1970s noted that the manor itself seemed to warp perception. Compass needles spun in place. Cameras produced blurred images even in daylight. In one case, an investigator recorded faint sounds within the ruins, what he described as fabric dragged across wood, again and again, like someone trying on garments. His tapes degraded within a week, replaced with a low hum no technician could identify. But perhaps the most unsettling testimony belongs to a collector who claimed to have acquired one of Eleanor's surviving dresses at an estate auction. The garment, a gray silk gown with an unfinished hem, was kept in his home for less than a month. During that time, he reported dreams of being sewn into clothing that was too tight to breathe, while a needle pricked his skin in steady rhythm. His wife awoke to find small puncture wounds on his arms, always in straight, even lines. After 30 days, he donated the dress to a museum collection, refusing to speak of it again. The museum placed it in storage, where staff later complained of stitching noises after hours. The dress has since gone missing from the archives, without record of removal. What emerges from these accounts is not simply a tale of disappearance, but of transformation, an ongoing process that began long before Eleanor vanished and has perhaps not yet ended. The 48 dresses were not mere garments, but disguises or vessels. The 112 letters were not diary entries, but instructions or confessions. And the emerald brooch, pinned deep into the desk, may not have been jewelry at all, but the anchor of a ritual, one that Eleanor either resisted or embraced in her final hours. The villagers of Ashcombe still speak cautiously of her. Older generations refuse to walk near the manor after dusk. Children are told never to pick green stones on the moors, for fear they are pieces of the brooch itself, shattered and scattered across the land. To this day, when strong winds sweep through the village, some claim they hear the sound of fabric snapping in the air, as though dresses are being hung in invisible rows, waiting for a figure who never left. If Eleanor Harroway was indeed taken, the question remains, by whom or by what? And why the fixation on clothing, on letters, on emerald? The clues are delicate, but together they form a haunting portrait of a woman preparing not for departure, but for metamorphosis, her absence less of vanishing, more an unveiling. And yet, the most troubling part is what came after. For decades, each new owner of the land reported disturbances tied not to Eleanor herself, but to the brooch. Always the brooch. A clasp that would not remain open, a pin that pierced deeper than it should, and a green light that seeped where no light ought to be. It was this object, more than the dresses or the letters, that many believe holds the true key to the mystery. For if the garments were disguises and the writings instructions, then the emerald was the lock or perhaps the door itself. By the time the emerald brooch passed into private hands in the early 20th century, its reputation was already cemented. Collectors prized it for its craftsmanship. A polished stone set into a silver clasp, intricate vines engraved along its edges. But those who lived with it claimed its beauty was secondary to its presence. More than one owner remarked that the clasp would not stay open for long. Within minutes of being pried apart, the pin snapped shut again with uncanny force, as though the metal itself resisted separation. Some likened it to a jaw that refused to unclench. The brooch's first well-documented custodian was a London antiquarian named Thomas Ray. He acquired it in 1921 from the estate of a retired sea captain whose family had kept it locked away for decades. Ray displayed the piece proudly in his study, speaking of its aura of history. Yet within weeks, servants reported hearing the sound of fabric rustling in rooms where no garments were kept. Ray himself confided to a colleague that he had begun receiving anonymous letters slipped under his door, pages filled with the same phrases Eleanor Harroway once wrote. The procession at the gate. The emerald must close. They do not know my shape. Ray's death was sudden. He was found collapsed across his desk, the brooch pinned into his palm so deeply it pierced muscle. Official records list his cause of death as heart failure. But among his papers, investigators found 48 sketches of women's dresses, numbered 1 through 48, each rendered with a precision that suggested more than idle curiosity. None of Ray's surviving relatives would claim the brooch. It disappeared from records soon after, only to resurface 30 years later in an auction catalog under the vague label Victorian Emerald Clasp, provenance uncertain. Those who have traced the object's path argue that the brooch is not merely cursed, but parasitic, feeding on attention, moving from one caretaker to the next under the guise of ornament. The letters Eleanor left behind describe it not as adornment, but as an entity. It watches me through green glass. When it closes, I am less. When it closes again, I will not be at all. The most unsettling modern testimony comes from a visitor to Ashcombe Manor in the 1960s, when the ruins were at their most desolate. He was a folklorist, drawn to the site by rumors of the dresses. According to his journal, he entered the west wing and discovered a single garment draped across a beam. The fabric was intact, though no one had lived there for nearly a century. At its collar, he saw a pinhole in the wood, perfectly round, with faint green discoloration bleeding outward like a bruise. He fled without touching it. Days later, he dreamed of Eleanor Harroway. She stood at the foot of his bed, holding the emerald brooch open as if to show him the clasp. When it snapped shut, he woke with a start, his chest marked by a thin red line running from collarbone to rib. He burned his notes shortly after. Only fragments survive. Skeptics dismiss such tales as the natural byproduct of folklore, a community constructing fear around tragedy. They argue that Eleanor was a reclusive woman suffering from isolation, perhaps engaged in ritualistic behavior born of mental illness. The dresses, the letters, the brooch, each a symptom of a mind unraveling. But even skeptics struggle to explain the continuity of details. The fixation on emerald, the repeated number 48, the persistent imagery of garments and transformations. When independent witnesses, separated by decades, describe the same sounds of stitching in empty rooms or the same green discoloration in wood, the theory of coincidence wears thin. Today, Ashcombe Manor is nothing more than a husk, its roof collapsed, its corridors swallowed by vines. Yet those who trespass still report strange sensations. A weight pressing across the shoulders, as though fabric were being draped over them. Some claim to see flashes of color in the moonlight, gowns suspended on invisible mannequins, fluttering in sequence. And always, at the heart of it, the glimmer of green. The most whispered speculation is also the most disturbing. That Eleanor Harroway never truly disappeared. That she was not taken, nor did she take her own life. Instead, she became what she feared. A vessel for something older, bound by dresses, sustained by letters, anchored by the emerald clasp. The 48 dresses were not her protections, but her shells. The 112 letters were not cries for help, but incantations preserving the passage. And the brooch was the lock that sealed her within, clicking closed not upon fabric, but upon her very self. If that is true, then each reported sighting is not a haunting but a continuation. Each rustle of fabric in an empty room is not memory but presence. Each green stain in wood or stone is not a remnant, but a root still alive. The mystery of Eleanor Harroway cannot be solved in the traditional sense. There will be no body to exhume, no culprit to accuse. What lingers is a pattern, a ritual that began in 1866 and echoes still. The unanswered question is whether the brooch has finished its work, or whether it waits, clasp still hungry, for the next to wear it. And so the dresses remain in legend, the letters in fragments, the brooch in shadows. A puzzle without end, a haunting without closure. The story of Eleanor Harroway is not a tale of the past, but a warning etched into fabric and stone. For some mysteries do not fade. They wait, patient as stitches in the dark, until the emerald closes again. And that is the story of Eleanor Harroway, the dresses, the letters, and the brooch that would not stay open. Some mysteries may never rest, but they remind us how thin the veil between past and present truly is. If you want more unsolved mysteries, paranormal encounters, and cryptid sightings told in quiet detail, subscribe to Silent Heirs, where the forgotten are never truly gone.